Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the Young Life and Times survey results launch and this year's webinar. You're very welcome. Very glad that you are interested and in the survey results and you are here today. I want to let you know that we are also recording this event. We are not recording discussion later on, but we are recording the presentation, which should last for about 30 minutes or so, the presentation of the key findings. So you are welcome to post questions or comments using the chat function. You can do that now while the presentation is ongoing, or you can do that afterwards. Again, there'll be some time for discussions and for questions, and hopefully you have brought some of those along. My name is Dirk Schubotz. I'm the director of the Young Life and Times survey, and I have been directing the survey since 2003. So this is nearly 20 years now. Well, it is 20 years that we've run the survey. And of course, that's not an undertaking by just one person, by me, but it's a team effort. And we've also got Martina McKnight and Paula Devine here today, and the other people that are involved in running the survey every year are Katrina Lloyd and Mike McCool. All of us are working at either Queen's University Belfast or Ulster University. Like ARC, the whole of ARC, Young Life and Times, is a joint adventure of the two universities. It has been since 2000. Okay, so the purpose of today's event is to introduce you to the key findings of the Young Life and Times survey of the 2022 survey. As I said, the survey has been running since 2003. So we are in the 19th iteration because there was 1 year in 2019 and 2020, 21 due to COVID where the survey couldn't run. Generally speaking, we have a range of resources where you can find about the survey and other resources that we have with ARC, and these are listed here. So all the Young Life and Times results, as all our other survey results, are available on our website. And the website address for Young Life and Times is here. So all the key findings, frequency tables, and cross-tabulations by gender and religion are available from today on our website, as you can see here. You can also look at all the other results from previous surveys. Some of the questions we've asked have been asked for a number of years, some of them since 2003. And you are more than welcome to have a look and compare our results. And some of these results I will refer to later on in the presentation. If you're so minded and able, you can also download the data set and undertake your own analysis. And I've mentioned my colleagues, Katrina Lloyd and Paula Devine, who are in charge of the two other surveys that we're running, namely the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, or NILT, or the Kids Life and Times survey, KLT, which are also annual surveys of adults and P7 children respectively. And again, results can be found online. And some of the questions asked in the Young Life and Times survey were also asked in NILT and KLT respectively. We also have some teaching resources for those of you who are interested in using Young Life and Times data and other survey data for teaching. And again, these are freely available online. As far as this year's survey is concerned, we had a range of funders, as always. The background questions we are asking, so these are questions on demographic backgrounds, whether our respondents are male or female, or whether, what school types they attend, how long they've been living in Northern Ireland, and so forth, are questions that are shared among all funders. We had questions on good relations, and these were funded by the Executive Office. We had questions on shared education and community relations, equality and diversity education. These were also included in the KLT survey, and these were funded by the Department of Education. We are delighted to be involved in the first attempts to develop a new policy around ending violence against women and girls. And again, the Executive Office funded us to ask some pilot questions. And there are currently some questions going into the Northern Ireland Life and Times Survey 2022, which is undertaken in autumn of this year, so in September, October, right up to December. We had some questions on career advice that young people receive in schools, and these were funded by the Deaf Children's Society Northern Ireland. We had questions on safety and attitudes to paramilitaries. These are funded by the Department of Justice, and in that case, these are questions that are also included in the Northern Ireland Life and Times Survey. And last but not least, we had questions on some political attitudes, and these were funded through an Economic and Social Research Council grant that was held at Queen's University, and the principal investigator of that is Professor Katie Hayward, I should say, who many of you will probably know from programs like The View or Sunday Politics and so forth. She's a regular pundit on these programs. As you can see here, version A and version B, there would be way too many questions to include them in all in one survey. It would be too long to complete those. So the questions were split amongst between two versions of the survey, and only some of these questions were included in both survey versions. In principle, this is how our fieldwork works. So we are drawing the sample of the 16-year-olds that are eligible to take part in our survey from the Child Benefit Register. We work directly with HMRC on that. Once we have the sample of 5,000 16-year-olds who are eligible every year, we'll send them an invitation letter out directly to their home address. They're invited to take part in the online survey. They receive some information about Young Life and Times, the background and why we chose them and what we want them to do. They can then decide to complete an online survey. We will send one reminder every year to those who haven't responded within about 10 days or 2 weeks. And everybody who responds by a particular deadline receives a 10-point gift voucher. So that's sent out to everybody who took part in the survey as a thank you to take part and spend the time. So the fieldwork generally takes place around about Easter time. So that was just at the end of March, start of April this year, as you will remember. And the fieldwork takes about 4 weeks to complete. I start off to tell you a little bit about the background of our respondents, so that you can get a sense of who took part in the survey. And these are sort of key demographic variables that we're presenting here. So as with most surveys, females are just slightly bit more eager to take part than males, or probably I should say need less convincing to take part. So in our case, 56% of our respondents were female and 42% were male. We also capture information from young people who do not identify as either male or female, and we've done that since 2013, and we see a growing trend and the rise in proportions of young people who do not identify as either male or female, and in 2022 we had 2%. So most of them identify as gender fluid, but there are also some trans young people who completed the survey. The large majority of our 16-year-olds have always lived in Northern Ireland, 89%, but 11% have moved to Northern Ireland over the last 16 years. And how long they've lived in Northern Ireland varies from 15 years to 1 year, just new arrivals. So it's a widespread of that. But again, the majority has been here all their life. We have 17% of our respondents who disclose a disability or long-term health condition. And if you look at the type of area in which young people live, you can see that it's relatively representative of the geographic situation in Northern Ireland. So the largest proportion, 43%, live in either small towns or cities, but we also have a significant proportion who live in rural areas or in the countryside, as is typical for Northern Ireland as a relatively rural country. But we also have some people who live in our big cities or the outskirts of the big cities. I do not think Bangor was counted as a big city at the time, But of course, now it is. So we have to monitor how that information changes over the next few years. We have a relatively accurate representation in terms of the school type that young people attend. So we'll see here that we capture about 7% who attend formally integrated schools or planned integrated schools. And that's exactly the proportion that in fact attend integrated education if you look at administrative data sets. And the proportion of grammar and secondary schools is roughly the one that you would expect. There are some young people at 16 who of course no longer attend school, but who are already in regional colleges or they attend special schools or on occasion home schools. And again, we have about 3% of those overall who do that. In terms of religious background, we'll see that 39% of the 16-year-olds identified with no religious background, and that's a proportion that has grown steadily over the last few years since 2003. So we see year by year an increase in 16-year-olds who identify as having no religious background. Nonetheless, we have when it comes to religion, the largest proportion would be Catholics, and that's a representation of the demographic situation in Northern Ireland, of course. We still have 23% Protestants, and we have, again, a growing number of young people who identify as having other religious backgrounds, and that includes predominantly Muslims, but also other religious backgrounds like Hindu or Sikh and so forth. We ask young people to self-identify their family financial background, and you can see here that a good half of all young people, 49%, just shy of 50%, believe that their financial situation is like average. We have about 13% who believe they are not well off at all or not well off, and we have about 1/3 who are describing their family background as well off. And there hasn't been very much change over time, but again, looking at the current economic situation, we will monitor that closely, how that changes. Okay, so that should give you a good idea of our respondents and the background that they have. So it is a relatively representative sample of 16-year-olds in Northern Ireland across those demographic background variables. And you would expect that from a random sample that we draw from the Child Benefit Register. So we feel very assured that the data we present today are a good representation of the attitudes and circumstances of 16-year-olds in Northern Ireland. I want to start with education. I'll talk a little bit on the new data. For the first time, we have that included on gender-based violence. I will then turn my attention to the questions on good relations and community safety. And some of these questions were asked, as I said, since 2003. So it's interesting to look at timelines and changes over time. And I want to, since it was a big year for Northern Ireland, we had local elections, I want to not miss out on giving some information on politics as well. And then there will be time for questions. So starting with education, again, these were funded by the Department of Education, but also the National Deaf Children's Society. And these are the questions that I want to come to in a minute. First of all, I need to acknowledge that we are still, the 16-year-olds still had some of the effects of the COVID-19, and questions that we put in as ARC and funded were these two questions on respondents' perception on the physical and mental health before the pandemic. And you can see here that there's a difference between how males and females perceive the impact that COVID-19 had on their mental and physical health. You can see here that on the left-hand side, that's the blue chart represents the male respondents. You can see here that a much larger proportion of males than females in the red and orange columns on the right-hand side reported that that there was very little impact, or that COVID had very little or no impact on their physical health. You can see also when it comes to mental health so that's the second part of the tables, of the charts that I present here, that 38% of males compared to 60% of females reported that their mental health was better before the COVID-19 outbreak. So that is a significant gender difference, so which would lead us to believe that the perception of poorer mental health as a result of COVID is much stronger amongst females. And that was exactly what we found last year, when we had a much longer module on COVID-19 and the impact on education. And when we look at that for the respondents in 2022, namely respondents agreeing or disagreeing that COVID-19 impacted negatively on their education. Again, the gender difference is very noticeable here. You can see that 42% of males, but 61% of females strongly agreed that COVID-19 impacted negatively on their education. So that's a significant gender difference. And again, that confirms the findings from last year's survey. I'm wanting to look at the two questions that were asked on behalf of the Northern Ireland Deaf Children's Society. And these are questions that we again asked for the first time, and they refer to careers advice that 16-year-olds receive in their school. And we didn't find a gender difference here, but it was interesting for us to look at whether or not there's a difference in relation to the careers advice that they receive by the school type that they attend. And you can see here in this particular table that overall, over 8 in 10, nearly 9 in 10 respondents said that in all school types said that they received careers advice in their school. The proportion in secondary schools was somewhat smaller than in grammar schools and in integrated schools, but overall, the data shows a relative consistency across all school types and with regard to careers advice received. The difference that we did find was in relation to those with disability and long-term illness. And we found that those who reported that they had a disability or long-term illness which affected them a lot were much less likely to receive careers advice in their school. In fact, only 66% of them said they received careers advice. So that's where the difference is. And that, of course, is a difference with regard to equality legislation and equal treatment of people with long-term illnesses or conditions or disability is a finding that should concern us. And again, if you look at the confidence of young people in relation to the careers options that they had and that they thought they had, you can see here that in that respect, males were slightly more confident than females. Okay, so 72% of males compared to 65% of females expressed that they were confident with the careers options that they were available to them. And I've merged here different responses of confidence, a lot of confidence, or very confident and confidence in that first table row. The proportion of those who are not very confident shows that a quarter of the females, but less than a quarter of the males expressed that they were not confident. Again, where the real difference lies was that those with disability and long-term illnesses were the ones who expressed the least level of confidence. And interestingly as well, and that's probably worth exploring further from our point of view, is that those young people who plan to go to university expressed lower levels of confidence in their careers options than those who said they would work full-time or work part-time when they leave school. So it seems to be that those who were looking for a university career after school were less confident in the subject choice and the careers choice that they've chosen, and those who chose not to do that but to go into full-time employment were more confident. One possible explanation could be that they might be going into family businesses. There could be an expectation there, or they might have offers already from companies or for apprenticeships or things like that, with a prospect of long-term employment. And of course, if you go to university, you wouldn't have that. Okay, so that could be one explanation, but it's worthwhile exploring further. Some questions on shared education, and I'm only including one slide here. Is that was really interesting to see whether shared education, so that's a policy that is active in Northern Ireland, which encourages schools, young people from different school types to mix, which are different classrooms or have projects together or undertake trips together, and the impact that COVID has had on that. So that was the first year where basically we had face-to-face teaching again, and we found that 51% of our respondents said that they were to some extent involved in shared education. Most of them were involved in joint projects, 67%. That was followed by joint classes, 40%, and 37% said they were sharing facilities such as sports grounds or computer labs or things like that. 43% of those who were not involved in shared education said they would like to be. And often, of course, as we know, there might be partnerships between schools, shared education partnerships, but only one form class from each school is involved. So it's probably the case that that more people are excluded than included in these projects. But the appetite for those is certainly there. In terms of the effect and the attitudes, 64% of those who had taken part in shared education agreed or strongly agreed that that it's enabled them to have better respect of the views of others. And that, of course, is one of the main aims of shared education. Okay. It can only be a snapshot today, and so I'm moving swiftly on to gender-based violence. Again, we're very excited to be involved in that new policy initiative, and Young Living Times was one of the first surveys where questions were piloted, where prevalence of gender-based violence was asked in a survey in Northern Ireland, and I want to report some of the findings here. So the respondents were presented with a definition, and the definition was that by acts of violence, we mean any criminal offenses or any words, behaviors which hurt or cause fear or anxiety to a victim, or which humiliate or belittle them. So the questions that we included were around the experience of different types of violence, the attitudes to different types of violence that may be experienced, and also whether or not the 16-year-olds knew people who had perpetrated different types of violence. And I'm going to present three quite longish graphs here, but they're color-coded, and the color coding hopefully will help you to see what our findings were. So here on the left-hand side, you can see the different kinds of violence that we've asked about. So going from the bottom to the top. So these are things like physical assaults or verbal assaults, but also then online and social media abuses, controlling behavior, interpersonal violence, things like being sent sexually explicit videos or photos, sexually suggestive jokes, unwanted touching, hugging, people invading personal spaces, street harassment, which includes like catcalling or wolf whistling, comments about physical appearance, and so forth. Okay, so you can see here the gender difference. So blue are the boys, red are the girls. And again, having a look at this slide, and again looking at the bottom, you can see that there are only two types of violence where males were more likely to experience them than females. And these are probably the ones that you would have expected: physical assaults and verbal abuse. So 69% of males, but only 60% of females reported experiencing verbal abuse. 59% of males and only 46% of females reported having been at the receiving end of physical assault. If you look at all the other categories, females are the ones that experience that the most. And again, if you look at the top of the graph here, the experience that most females were likely to have was that they received uninvited comments about their physical appearance. And in fact, 82% of females reported that. There's still quite a significant proportion of males who reported that. But then if you look at the graph below that, it's street harassment, so that's the catcalling or the wolf whistling, you can see that there's a really significant difference between males and females' experiences here. 75% or 3/4 of 16-year-olds have been harassed on the street, and that compares with just 30% of boys who had that experience. Other experiences show that the difference between males and females is less significant. If you look at invading personal space, for example, it's almost equal proportions of males and females have reported that. But overall, if you look at that, at the experience of violence by gender, you can see that except for verbal abuse and physical abuse, females are much more likely than males to experience that. No. Do young people think that any of that behavior is acceptable? We can probably expect it that the vast majority of 16-year-olds would respond that they don't find that acceptable. But again, remembering that street harassment was the experience that most females had compared to males, you can see here that even in terms of the acceptability levels, there's a gender difference at the bottom of this slide. Okay, street harassment, 91% of females found that this is unacceptable or never acceptable, whereas it was only 73% of males who felt the same. When it came to all the other experiences, except for probably making a sexual comment or joke, so that's a third bar here, 94% of females felt that was never acceptable, but only 73% of males. But if you look at all the other experiences, the vast majority of both males and females find these behaviors, these types of violence, unacceptable. Nonetheless, there are some gender differences, as the graph shows. And last graph on this topic is whether young people knew perpetrators of these types of violence. And here you can see again that there is a difference. In this case, the difference is the opposite, and you would probably expect that. So we do know that males are slightly more likely to be, or actually more likely to perpetrate these types of violence, and consequently, males are also the respondents who were more likely to know other perpetrators. You can see here, when it comes to touching, hugging, kissing a girl or woman without consent, 57% of males said they knew somebody who'd done that, compared to 29% of females. The difference was smallest when it came to posting a joke of a sexual nature about a girl or a woman, where you can see that 47% of males, but also 41% of females knew somebody who'd done that. Controlling behavior is something that really interests us and connects well with previous work we've done on coercive control last year with our colleagues in Ulster University. This shows that males are much more aware, have a higher level of awareness of perpetrators who applied controlling behavior than females. And again, that's ongoing work and is really interesting, and we'll probably continue working in this area. But generally speaking, so looking at that, females not unexpectedly have greater levels of violence experience than males. Males show a slightly more acceptance level than females, and males know significantly more perpetrators than females do. So these are probably the key takeaway figures from that research. But again, it's a pilot research. We'll continue to work with the Executive Office on that, and also have some qualitative follow-on projects ongoing at the moment. And the aim of that is develop policy and implement that then to tackle these issues. What was interesting for us as survey organizers was that when it came to the set of questions on perpetrating violence, we found that a very large proportion of young men, much larger than normally would be expected, opted out of responding to these questions. And instead, we received some of these comments. So, and some of them I've put here, which show that some men feel very strongly that these are issues that young men also face, and we cannot just look at violence against girls. We also must include violence against women. And equally, we do know from other research that young people from LGBTQ+ communities feel have high levels of experience of interpersonal violence or violence generally. And you can see here in the purple comment as well that that some of respondents felt that we should ask about LGBTQ+ communities' experience of violence, which of course we can do because we have background questions on that. These are quotes. So there's a type, of course, LGBTG+, should be Q+, but that's a quote directly taken from a young person as well. So what I want to say with that is that this is a topic which is really has a lot of passion amongst young people. There's a high level of experience of violence, and it's probably something that we need to address. Okay, I'm coming to good relations. So that's a second from last section already. And yeah, I want to come to a number of questions now, which in fact we've asked since 2003. And the first of those questions is whether young people think that the relationships between Protestants and Catholics are better now than they were 5 years ago. And if you ask the question over a long period of time, this is what you can do. You can present it as a timeline, which we have done here, and you can see the ups and downs in relation to the perception of relations now compared to 5 years ago. What I want to draw your attention on is, so you can see, depending on political developments, that the views of the young people change over time. You know, they go up and down, positive or negative views go up and down. Overall, what we can see here is that if we were drawing a straight line through all these responses over the years, we could see here that very little has changed in terms of the perception. If anything, if you compare 2022, that's the last column here, and 2003, so that's the first survey, the proportion of Catholics who feel that their relations are better now than 5 years ago has decreased, and really from 48 to 36% has decreased notably. The proportion amongst Protestants has increased over time from 34% to 42%, and the proportion of those with no religious background who feel that their relations are better now than they were 5 years ago. If we compare just 2 years, 2003 to 2022, we would have to conclude there's very little change. But of course, as the graph shows, there is change, and the change goes hand in hand with macro political developments in Northern Ireland. If you then look into the future, a similar question, will relations improve in 5 years' time compared to now? We can see something very similar. As you can see here, so again, the Catholics are less positive in 2022 than they were in 2003, and significantly so. The Protestants are slightly more pessimistic, and the same applies to those with no religious backgrounds. Again, if you're drawing a straight line through that graph, you can see that overall the trend is relatively modest, but there's ups and downs over time in line with macro political developments and so forth. So will religion then always make a difference how young people feel about each other? That's a figure that's much more straight. So there's a slight decline over time over the last 20 years, but only 11 percentage points if you take the 86% in 2003 and the 75% in 2022. So still 3/4 of 16-year-olds who have all grown up into the peace process and don't remember the actual worst of the conflict feel that religion will make a difference around how people feel about each other in Northern Ireland. Again, trend is downwards, but ever so slightly. Do young people then feel that they would prefer mixed religion environments? And again, it's a question that we've asked in 2003. And we asked about 3 preferences. Would they like to live in mixed religion neighborhoods? Would they like to go to work in mixed religion workplaces? And if they had children, would they send them to mixed religion schools? And again, you can see a relative stability here in the 3 graphs. So the green one shows the workplace. It has consistently been the area where young people felt most comfortable with mixing. Neighborhood comes next. And now we have to say, after 20 years or so, very closely aligned with preferences for mixed religion schooling. So that has increased over time. But again, if you look at the graphs here, 2003, 48%, 2022, 57%, ever so slightly over the last 20 years. Last question on the good relations then is the appreciation of diversity in our society. So do young people feel, broken down by their religious backgrounds, that the respectively other communities make a contribution to the culture and tradition that we have and the diversity that we have in Northern Ireland society? And you can see here, as you would expect, that Protestants are more likely to think that Protestants make a contribution. Catholics are more likely to think that Catholics make a contribution, and there's relative, like a much less diverse response from respondents with no religious backgrounds, but still, they're most likely to think that those are probably most likely, like them, minority ethnic backgrounds or non-Catholics, non-Protestants make the biggest contribution to the society that we have. Again, you would probably expect that. We monitor changes over time, and we'll see that there's some slightly more moderate views expressed over time, year by year. When it comes to community safety, and these are questions we asked on behalf of the Department of Justice, you can see that the large proportion of young people feel that there's a strong sense of community in the area where they live, and also that most people abide by the law. Only a minority feel that people in this area feel protected by the law and the justice system, 45%. Even smaller minority feels that people are not confident reporting crime and antisocial behavior to the PSNI. So that's the police, of course, in Northern Ireland. That was traditionally, at the time of conflict, an issue, as some of you who will be here will know. So it's an important question. Trust in policing is really something that we need to be aware of, need to capture. Only just about a third of the respondents felt that the PSNI keeps the area safe, and about half of our young people felt that there are low levels of crime, drugs, and antisocial behavior in the area. And in reverse, then 31% felt there's a lot of crime and antisocial behavior among young people in the area. When it comes to paramilitary influence, of course, we would expect these numbers to be relatively small, but we can see that still 12% of 16-year-olds felt that paramilitaries have a controlling influence on the communities where they lived. And we still had 6% of 16-year-olds expressing the view that the paramilitaries kept their areas safe. So it's a small proportion, but nonetheless a notable proportion of young people who felt that. There was a much higher proportion who felt that paramilitaries create fear and intimidation, and of course that they contribute to crime and drug dealing, antisocial behavior. There was a relatively modest proportion of 12% who felt that young people are too much influenced by paramilitaries in the area. We can break that down by areas, but for this presentation here, we can, I'm just presenting the headline figures. We've looked in the past, and as you would expect, you will find that this proportion changed significantly according to whether these young people live in mixed religious neighborhoods or loyalist or Republican neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, and so forth, and you would expect that. So, but that's just the headline figure. So I'm finishing off with some of the findings that we have on political attitude questions. And as you know, we had elections in May. The survey was undertaken in March and April, so quite close to the elections. And we asked some questions on young people's voting behavior, if they could vote. And this pie chart here presents that. So we asked young people, if an election was held tomorrow and 16-year-olds could vote, which party would you vote for? And you can see that the highest proportion, the most successful party would be the party of the non-voters, or the people who don't know. So these are the two gray areas here on the left of the pie chart, 50% and 27% respectively. So over 40%, 42% in fact, to be precise, said they would not vote or they would not know who to vote. If you look at all the other graphs and the parties that they would vote for, you can see that the green parties, and these are the nationalist and Republican parties respectively, Sinn Féin and SDLP, would end up among 16-year-olds with the highest share of votes, 28 overall, if you combine them. That compares with 16% of DUP and UUP voters. And then, there's always the perception that young people would be more moderate and would be more likely to vote for Green Party or Alliance Party and so forth. You can see here that the share that the Alliance Party and the Green Party would get from 16-year-olds would be 9% for Alliance and 3% for the Green Party. So it's not very much different, to be honest. And in fact, what I've done here is I have overlaid the actual election results with the election preferences of the 16-year-olds. I have excluded all young people who said that they would not vote or they would not vote, as they would be excluded in an election as well. They wouldn't count if they don't turn up at the ballot box. And you can see that actually the difference is relatively small. So there will be a slightly higher proportion of Sinn Féin voters and Alliance voters, but it's not very noticeable, and SDLP voters, and there's slightly lower proportion of DUP and UUP voters amongst 16-year-olds. The Green Party would indeed fare a bit better, but would also still only get about 6% of the votes. And when it comes to others like individual candidates or TUV and so forth, and again, they had an option to mention these, and they did. From TUV to people before profit and individual candidates that they were aware of that they would vote for, you can see that 16-year-olds were less inclined to vote for these parties or the other parties or individual candidates. So overall, if anything, it's probably a representation of the demographic change in Northern Ireland. There's no evidence for like a significantly different voting behavior amongst 16-year-olds that we can see here. The last two slides are dealing with political attitudes and political identities. And again, that ties in quite well with what I've presented before on voting behavior. So these is a question on how they identify themselves. And you can see that 29% of 16-year-olds identified as nationalist, 26% as unionist, and 24% said they were neither. There was one in 5 young people who said they didn't know what they identified with, probably representing demographic changes again and religious disengagement and so forth. We asked the question on the Good Friday Agreement, and again, it was a very lively debate, in particular around the elections that we had, whether or not it's relevant, whether or not the arrangements around the Good Friday Agreement, how government is formed, is still relevant, since we are now sitting for about 5 months without a government, and there seems to be very little we can do. But you can see that the majority of young people felt that the Good Friday Agreement was still important and relevant for their generation. But there was a noticeable difference between those who identified as nationalists and those who identified as unionists. 60% of those who were nationalists, but only 47% of those who were unionists felt that it's still important, relevant, which is interesting when you compare that with the political discourse that was held around the elections, in particular by the Democratic Unionist Party. There was a shift in emphasis on the Good Friday Agreement, and in particular in relation to Brexit arrangements. So it was interesting to see among 16-year-olds that we found that actually those who identified as nationalists were more likely to say that the agreement is more important. We could have maybe expected a higher proportion of those who identify as unionists following the political lead, so to speak, from the unionist parties in relation to that, but we didn't see that. A very small proportion felt that it's not relevant or no longer relevant for their generation. We did note about 10% overall who have not heard about the Good Friday Agreement. But that was very different between those who were identifying as nationalist unionists and those who identified as neither or didn't know what they were. When it comes to Brexit and the Brexit protocol, we asked whether they felt that on balance the protocol was good, bad, or they didn't know for Northern Ireland. And you can see here again a slight difference between those who identify as nationalist unionists. So the Greens are the ones who identify as nationalists. 19% felt that it was on balance good, compared to with just 10% of the ones that identified as unionists who said it was good. And you would expect that probably was almost more than twice the proportion of those who identified as nationalists and unionists felt that the protocol was bad. The highest proportion of those said they didn't have enough information to make a judgment call on whether it was good or bad, and there was still a significant proportion as well who felt that they didn't know or haven't heard about the protocol. So that was interesting as well. I personally probably would have expected the proportion of those who said they have never heard about the protocol to be slightly smaller, to be honest. Okay. When it comes to priorities that young people themselves would set for government, what politicians should focus on in Northern Ireland, you can see here that healthcare came out top, including mental health care, which is something that young people talk a lot in our surveys about. Economic growth and tackling poverty came second, equality and human rights third, the environment and climate change came fourth, LGBTQ rights and women's rights fifth, and the Northern Ireland's constitutional status, which is what politicians like to talk about a lot, actually amongst young people came last in the hierarchy, just above something else that they would like to talk about. Okay, so that sums up the main findings for this year's Young 11 Times survey. There are more data available on our website, as I said, and of course, as we always do, we've already started planning for the next survey. The likely topics in 2023 will include mental health, again, good relations, politics. We will continue our work on gender-based violence with the Executive Office, and we will also continue our work with the Department of Justice on tackling paramilitarism and community safety. We are due to publish a research update on good relations this autumn. We have just updated our website and hopefully brought it into this millennium. It looks a bit more snazzy and nicer, but we are very interested in your comments, what you think. We will also have more engagement activities and publications. As I said, that's 20 years of Young 11 Times now. It deserves more focus and attention, and we are in the process of planning that. You can keep up to date with news on our website, our newsletters. We also sometimes use Facebook and Twitter, and you're more than welcome to follow us. And the more followers we have, the more encouraged we probably are to be active on Facebook and Twitter. If you want to contact us directly, you can do so by emailing us, and us in that case is myself or Martina McKnight, who is a research fellow who works on YLT. And last but not least, I want to thank all members of the team again. That includes Paula Devine, who has also arranged today's webinar and works the background that everything works okay. Katrina Lloyd, who is a YLT Director, but has also written the report on shared education. Mike McCool, who is our IT consultant, and we are very grateful to HMRC, who always provide the sample for us. And we have a wonderful new designer of our results flyer, which is also available now on our website, Mark Seaton. Very happy with the work that he does for us, and the mail company RW Pierce, who arranges all our mails. So that's it from me.